Hello, everybody. Recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 39 of the Movement Debrief. And we got a doozy, folks. Questions from you, answered by me. Let's make it happen. We're going to talk about ulnar nerve and snapping tricep. What happens when they sublux? What happens when they're making noise? What happens when things aren't going well with your elbow? That's number one. Number two is going to be something. Active and passive variability tests. Why do I use what I use to measure variability? Stay tuned. And the last question, but not the least question, what is the relationship between pelvic tilts, lumbar lordosis, among other things? That's what's on docket for tonight. But before we get there, how about some housekeeping? Did you guys see my blog this last week? So this blog was about a mentorship session that I did with my boy, #Bay, David Rasco. I worked with one of his peeps, and we discussed my thought process in terms of why I made clinical decisions with the person that we worked with. It was a whole lot of fun. I enjoyed it to a great degree, and I hope you guys enjoyed it as well. And if you have any questions regarding that post, fire away. So that's that. Otherwise, what's going on? Oh, of course, how could I forget? September 15th and 16th, people. In Seattle, Washington, Human Matrix is coming. I just wrote a nice little outline on it. We're starting to dive in a little bit into prep for that, so I'm really excited about that. We're going to talk about establishing variability, building power, building capacity in the people that we work with. So if you want to maximize movement for your people and you want to help them, help utilize movement to reach their goals, you probably want to check that out. So put it on your calendar, 15th and 16th. Also, I'm making a little bit of headway in my product that's going to be out for you guys. And what this is going to involve is I am going to be going through cases that I've worked with. And I'm going to do commentary through these cases, go on some little tangents to discuss some things. But sometimes the best way that we can learn how to apply some of the stuff that I talk about or other of my colleagues talk about is by just watching it happen and interacting within that clinical interaction. So you guys should check it out. I will get you more information once I have more information on it. It takes some time editing. I'm trying to do as best I can for this for you guys. So stay tuned with that. Otherwise, the week's been good. Last weekend was good. I'm looking forward to this upcoming weekend. But other than that, I hope your guys' week has been treating you well, and let's debrief, shall we? First question comes from TJ. He wants to know treatment for bilateral ulnar nerve subluxations / snapping tricep syndrome. TJ, it's a pretty good question. It's a very good question, in fact. And what we're going to talk about, I think, in order to better understand that is the concept of variability, because that's going to be paramount for this. Now, for those who don't know what that is, sometimes the ulnar nerve, which runs in this little groove right here, when you hit your funny bone, it's not really a bone, it's your ulnar nerve. You can touch it like I'm touching it right now and getting zingers down my hand. Don't do it for long. It kind of doesn't feel the best. But sometimes that nerve can sublux out of the groove that it's in. And that can lead to problems in a lot of things. You might also get a snapping of the triceps tendon when you move your elbow. That could be another possibility. And the treatment for these types of conditions is still really the same as anything else. You establish variability, build power, build capacity, get them on their way. Now, sometimes you have to go locally to the elbow. And that doesn't mean you got to do local treatments. But from a variability standpoint, there can be alterations at the elbow joint itself in terms of what it's doing. And so we have to understand and know what we need out of an elbow to make it a healthy elbow, to make it a variable elbow. So 4 movements. You got flexion. You got flexion. You got extension of the elbow. And you have ulnar radial deviation. And I apologize. I just realized I'm kind of screwing up Facebook. So let me do that right there. Okay. So flexion. The extension, ulnar radial deviation. No, I'm sorry, pronation, supination. I treated someone with wrist pain today, so I had to look at that a little bit more. But what you do then is we would expect to have full motion at all these joints. But a lot of times in an individual who maybe has a snapping tricep syndrome lacks that. And there's really two possible scenarios that I often see. You either have someone who has just a locked up elbow in all directions, or you have someone who has laxity in the sagittal plane, so maybe they have hyperextension, but then maybe they're locked in pronation or supination. So you really kind of have to appreciate all of those planes and treat within those planes. And the fix for this is to know what two motions or two planes you have to drive at the same time in order to restore variability. So for example, generally, think about your biceps. Flexion and supination go together. So a lot of times I'm combining those movements. If I have a limitation in supination, I'm generally driving flexion along with that to elicit that action. If I am going to extend, pronation generally goes along with that a little bit more. So you have to look at, do the people you're working with have these movements available in their movement repertoire? That's the big key. So if they don't, then we have to get those. If they have movements that they shouldn't have, but yet still limitations, we have to address that as well. So let me unpack that just a little bit. So if I have someone who is limited in supination, for example, I'm going to perform activities that involve supination. So a lot of times I will use bicep curls and things along those lines to restore supination. A lot of times that works pretty well. Now the type of bicep curl that you use matters, and it depends on what's going on up here. For example, if I have someone who has full IR, maybe a lax shoulder, you want to put them in an IR position and start doing some concentration curls in the supinated position, because I need to make sure that I have good movement capabilities going on in the shoulder itself and then drive the elbow range of motion that is lacking. On the flip side, if I have someone who has a pronation limitation, remember that often goes with elbow extension, I'm going to be doing activities where I'm doing pronation and driving elbow extension. Side plank variations work wonders in that regard. And really the fix is the same if you have someone who has a lax elbow as well. So you got someone who's got a lot of hyperextension, but you don't have supination and pronation. For these people, we need reinforcement of the anterior structures of the elbow, because that could be a potential reason why they have laxity. And so what you do in this case is you want to do activities, pending whether it's supination or pronation that's limited, that involve bicep, because that is going to reinforce the anterior portion of the elbow. And so for these types of people, I do curls this way, I do curls this way, I do curls this way, I do your Zottman curls, and then pending what range of motion they have or don't have, I will either drive more external rotation or more internal rotation. Another thing to consider, carrying angle. If I have someone who's got that big valgus or that carrying angle like so at the elbow, I have to get them in away from this position, because typically what's going on is you have someone who is getting external rotation here at the humerus that's poking out this way. Maybe they can't drive supination, so they're trying to drive relative supination at this joint itself, and then you get some type of laxity. So for these people, you need to reinforce that by, guess what, going the direction that they can't go. And so what I'm doing for this is your side plank variations. I'm driving pronation with the elbow extension in this type of position so I can get a subscap, internally rotate the humerus, and you ought to be in business. So to summarize that point, if you can restore variability with these people, what you want to make sure is that supination and pronation are restored. If I have too much elbow extension, I want to try to do things to reinforce flexion so I can reinforce the anterior structures of the elbow. And also think about combining limitations in supination with flexion, limitations in pronation with extension. You do those things, you ought to be in business from establishing variability at the elbow joint. Now, I'm trying to think of a couple cases in which I have a girl right now, actually. She doesn't have snapping triceps, but she's got some severe pronation limitations. And she had supination limitations as well. And so to restore the supination, she also had an ER limitation at that shoulder. So an example exercise in her case is to have her doing a bicep curl that's relatively out here, just keeping the forearm supinated the whole time. And we're with just, your classic 3 sets of 10, with that activity alone, we were able to restore full supination, no pain. It was pretty awesome. And we got a ton of wrist motion after that too, because she was limited in the wrist. So that's a really good move that I like. And what we've been driving with her a lot is side plank variations, drive pronation. I also have her starting to do curls in a neutral to slight pronated position to see if we can drive that as well. But the crux of driving variability at any joint, even if it's something you're unfamiliar, is you're trying to get them to do the movement that they can't do. And so if they can't pronate, then you need to do activities that involve pronation. If they can do too much pronation, and they shouldn't be able to, for example, say they don't have full elbow extension, but they have full pronation, we know that shouldn't be the case. So if that's one possible scenario, then we want to do activities that go the opposite direction so we can reinforce the areas that ought not be limited. So point being, think about what movements they don't have, get them those movements, and if they have movements that they shouldn't have, and remember, flexion and supination go together, pronation and extension go together, reinforce the opposite direction, and you ought to be in business. TJ, good question. Before I go to the next question, one other thing to do as well, after you've restored variability, don't forget the importance of neurodynamics, especially if you have an ulnar nerve that is subluxing. So sliders, muy importante. And all you got to do for that is, the funny glasses face. This right here, folks, that's got ulnar nerve written on it for days. So you can do movements such as sliders, tensionus, that will help restore the normal excursion of the ulnar nerve, especially if you now have an elbow that has full variability restored. TJ, phenomenal question. Next question comes from, who is this? Next question comes from Alex. He's got a few questions in here. What took you to choosing of your active and passive tests for variability as well as power and capacity? What did you see in the AMT in Copenhagen that tests such as the adduction lift test did not have? Thanks again for the continued content, Z Cup. Really looking forward to your case study product. Alex, good question. So the reason why I've probably changed a lot of my tests in, say, the last year or two and started using some different things is just based on clinical experience, based on conversations I've had with Bill Hartman, who I'll link in the show notes, based on just clinical practice and based on the people who I work with. There were some holes that I was finding within my treatment skill set that just weren't cutting it with what I was currently using. So I tried to do some things to alter that so I could get more favorable adaptations. And from a passive standpoint, the biggest thing that has impacted my treatment the most has been the infrasternal angle, bar none. Because I think before, when we had our intent or our goal as finding or establishing the zone of apposition, you could never really have an objective measure in terms of when that was established. And that's where I think the infrasternal angle comes in very handy. Because when you have a measure that you can look at that says, yes, this person is good here and they got it, that's incredibly impactful, because that's probably the most important thing we can do is restore the position that the rib cage is in to allow for full diaphragm excursion. So to have an objective measure that looks at the most important piece of our treatment paradigm, I think that is incredibly important. And just looking at that alone has streamlined and made me have to look at a lot fewer tests that maybe weren't as reliable, such as just looking at some of the breathing excursion tests. I don't really care for those as much, and I never looked at them as much because it's hard to be objective about it. You know, can we really tell that they're filling the left lung versus the right? I don't know. There's no real good measure for that. But I'll tell you what, you can pull out a goniometer and you can measure an infrasternal angle. So I like that test a lot. Other tests that I think are very important that I use would be, if we're talking uppers, to me, external, internal, and horizontal abduction are huge. I like seated trunk rotation. I think those are all big. Let's talk about those a little bit. With the horizontal abduction and trunk rotation, with that, we can look at rotation of the thoracic spine, namely the thorax. When I'm looking at a horizontal abduction, based on where the scapula attaches, we're thinking T1 to T7, T8, in terms of where that's rotating. When I do full seated trunk rotation, it's probably a little bit further down, maybe all the way down to T12. So you can get an appreciation for how well the thorax rotates, and that can dictate your treatment based on infrasternal angle and that measure, or those two measures. I like external and internal rotation because those give you an appreciation for how well I'm doing on this portion of the rib cage and the posterior aspect of the rib cage. So for me, if I can really have a good pump handle action on the front side of the rib cage and I can fill up that lung, typically you see full internal rotation along with that. And it has to do with where the scapula sits in relation to the rib cage. On the flip side, if I have full external rotation, a lot of times that's associated with full posterior thorax expansion or dorsal rostral, which is some of the terminology that we utilize. So you can look at those measures, which are a bit more objective, to provide a proxy for what's going on here at the torso or the thorax. Down low, what I look at is Ober's, hip abduction, and then I like hip external and internal range of motion, because those give me very similar measures to what the upper stuff is looking at. For an Ober's test, that to me is my frontal plane measure, much like the infrasternal angle is the frontal plane measure of here. Because if I can adduct a femur, then we can reason to believe that perhaps the pelvis is able to open up its relative, the pelvic outlet. Because in order for the femur to adduct, the outlet, so if this is the infrapubic angle, the infrapubic angle and the outlet necessarily has to do that, right? I have to put these bones closer to one another. My ability to abduct is the reverse of that. So if I can abduct, then the pelvis ought to be able to narrow. So if you assume that there's femurs out here and this is my pelvis, if I do this, that is relative abduction of the femurs. So narrower infrapubic angles beget greater hip abduction. And then external and internal rotation give you some ideas in terms of what's going on with the anterior and posterior structures of the hip. So we have a frontal plane measure, and then we have something that looks at front to back. Much like at the thorax, external and internal rotation look at what's going on front to back at that area. So to me, that's what I use for passive variability, and that's how I've tried to simplify it in my mind as best as possible so I can explain it to yourselves and also make more informed clinical decisions. Now, from active test standpoint, the big two that I utilize are the active midstance test and the Copenhagen Adduction Test, or the CAT test. How about that? Why did I pick these as opposed to using the adduction lift test as an example? The reason why is, especially the active midstance in particular, the big difference between that and the adduction lift test is the floor. The active midstance, in my opinion, at least from levels 1 through 3 of the adduction lift test, is much more challenging than the halt or the adduction lift test. And the reason why it is because you have to coordinate ground contact with all the hip maneuvers and then put yourself in a position that appreciates all three planes. Also, if we think about it, if the goal is to try to see how well someone can manage mid-stance with some of these performance tests, because that is a nice proxy between going one direction, so like late stance versus one direction being early stance. So it's kind of our midpoint between each extreme of range of motion, flexion, extension, IR, ER, so on and so forth. In that position, the hip ought to be into some extension. So that's why I like the mid stance, because the bottom hip is extended. That would be the stance leg. In the halt, as an example, the hip is relatively more flexed. So can we say that that's a good mid stance test? I don't know. I also like, hang on, Katie. Yes, I agree so much too. That's another thing. Katie made a good point on that Instagram, baby. Katie said it's much less easier. It's much harder to cheat on the mid stance than it is the halt. And not just from a client standpoint, but from a practitioner standpoint. I think there's too many compensatory things that can happen in a halt that could make it tough to interpret or be objective or reproducible. When you don't have to have someone on your shoulder like in the mid-stance test, you can spend a little bit more time getting a 360 view in terms of what they're doing. And you can pick up on any compensatory strategies that they may or may not use. So that's a good point, Katie. That's why I use the mid-stance versus the adduction lift test. Now, I like the Copenhagen as my later portion of the exam because it's freaking hard. It's so hard. I don't know if you guys have tried this, but for a lot of my people, they can't even get into the position. But what you have to do essentially is line yourself up so you're relatively neutral. Now, is there such a thing as neutral? We don't need to get into that. But you line yourself into a relative straight line, and then you have to be able to maintain frontal plane activity the entire time for 15 reps without deviating in any plane. It's really, really challenging. And so you can really tell if you've truly maximized one's ability to control the frontal plane, and not only that, but control it without undue fatigue. And that's really why I like the Copenhagen, is because it's so darn challenging. It gives me some credence to say we need to continue to chase this variability thing until you get that up to snuff. Moreover, there is a little bit of research out there on that test to show that if you could hit 3 sets of 15, now I have to relook at the study, but I'll link it in the show notes. But if you look at if you were able to do 3 sets of 15 on the Copenhagen, then your injury likelihood of getting a groin injury, or I can't remember everything that was in that list, but injuries in that vicinity are significantly reduced. So it's somewhat evidence-based. Now, am I extrapolating a little bit from that? Yeah, most likely. But to me, it's harder to find a good frontal plane measure that has at least some evidence to support it in any other context. So that's why I like that test, and that's why I've chosen those two tests to help dictate the later phases of my treatment. And so to summarize, from passive variability testing, I wanted to simplify things as much as possible. I wanted to get an appreciation for things up top, the center, the infrasternal angle, things down low, measuring all three planes. And then the reason why I chose the active test that I did is because they're challenging. I think they appreciate mid-stance a bit more effectively, and they're much harder to control and coordinate than something like an adduction lift test. So, Alex, good question. Katie's got a question on Instagram. Hang on. Can you modify Copenhagen for people with medial knee pain, or then would it be contraindicated? Now, that's a good point. So Katie asked, can you modify the Copenhagen for people with medial knee pain? What if I told you this, Katie? What if that is the solution for getting rid of the medial knee pain? For example, or let me unpack that, I should say. With that test, if you cannot generate enough tension from the abdominals the top side adductor has to work more effectively. Because that's exactly what we're trying to do, is coordinate the top side adductor with the bottom side abs, getting those guys to work together. So if you can't get enough abs, you're going to get more adductor. You get more adductor, that could potentially put some strain on the medial knee. So what that should tell you is you have to alter your treatment in such a manner that you're getting more frontal plane abdominals, so that medial knee pain in that position is reduced. That's assuming that you've restored passive movement variability before you even get there and you got an active mid-stance where you need it to be. Good question. Don't modify. Push onward. Get some abs. Arthritic changes to the knee. Ooh, okay. I would still say the rules apply if possible. Another test I think you could do is, even if they can do a split squat, that's something you could potentially look at also. And it might be a little bit more impactful for someone who maybe can't lie in that position because of, degenerative changes in the knee. And I'm thinking like an inline split squat, or a split squat where they're actively adducting the bottom leg. That could also give you a little bit more challenging appreciation of mid-stance than, say, the active mid-stance or Copenhagen. I really don't think that, and I mean, I say that I use these tests, guys, but what I think we also have to be careful with is that we're not going so far into this that we, at the expense, lose or don't chase conditioning type things. I test the active mid-stance in the Copenhagen realistically on probably half of the people that I work with on a regular basis. Because sometimes, especially with maybe an individual who's of age that they would have arthritic knee changes, the important thing is just to get them in good shape and condition. And if you can get the person who maybe had a total knee and they can't ever get in the active or the Copenhagen position, if they are deadlifting and they're squatting and they're split squatting and they're doing step-ups and they're doing single leg RDLs and they can get up off the floor without problems, you probably don't need the Copenhagen. The Copenhagen really is just fine-tuning. And even the same thing with the active mid-stance test. We need to get people training and not just doing some of the silly moves that we do for variability. And I think that's something that a lot of us overlook or lack. So, well, I think those two active tests are very good, Katie, and I use them. They're not always appropriate for everyone, and make sure you're just getting your people moving, getting them training, and getting them into the positions that they need to get into in order to meet their goals. So for someone like that, split squat, can they do that and tap the ground? Cool. Move on. Help them get after it. Awesome question, Katie. Seriously. All right. Next and last question. Someone's commenting on Facebook, and I can't check it. Sorry. Dana asks, holy debrief. We need to talk about posterior pelvic tilt, lumbar lordosis, wide-eye ASA. Mama is confused. I'm sorry, Mama's confused. Let me see if I can help you with that. So I made a comment in the last debrief where, let me write a little something down real quick. I got to take a couple notes. So ISA, Bill, last debrief, Copenhagen. Okay. So last debrief, I made a comment that lumbar lordosis and anterior pelvic tilt don't go hand in hand. And this has to do with mechanics of the spine. And I'm going to apologize to you guys in advance because I don't think I'm going to give you a clear-cut answer. Because I don't think movement is going to have a clear-cut answer in this case. If we look at normal mechanics, and if you look at the book Trigger Points, Muscle Chains and Osteopathy, I'll link it in the show notes. The curves of the spine, we have a lordotic cervical spine, a kyphotic thoracic spine, a lordotic lumbar spine, and a kyphotic sacrum. So there's alternating kyphotic and lordotic curves. If curves exaggerate, so if I make a sacrum more kyphotic, then what's going to happen is all the other curves will exaggerate. So a kyphotic or a more nutated sacrum begets increased lumbar lordosis, begets increased thoracic kyphosis, begets increased cervical lordosis. If I lessen the curves of the spine, for example, I reduce the lordotic curve of the lumbar spine, that's going to make the sacrum more counternutated or less kyphotic. That'll make the thoracic spine less kyphotic. That'll make the cervical spine less lordotic. We all in the clear. With that, when we look at the sacral mechanics, we have to realize what happens with the sacrum in relation to the pelvis. And I meant to bring a model and I forgot, so I am so sorry. But as the sacrum nutates, it goes forward, that leads to a relative posterior rotation of the innominate on that side. Just has to do with normal sacroiliac joint mechanics. Now, is it moving that much? No, guys, I get it. If I counternutate the sacrum, that leads to a relative anterior rotation of the innominate. Now, I'm being very clear about this because I don't think I was as clear with this last time I spoke. And I'm using rotation versus tilt. And the reason why is because I think it can get confusing when we're thinking of, we see people with a huge lordotic curve and the pelvis looks like it's tilted anterior. To me, relative tilt deals with what orientation we perceive at the pelvis. And we can't trust our eyes because we really don't know what's going on from a mechanical standpoint at the spine or at the innominate for that matter. Because guess what? Guys, if I nutate the sacrum, and I nutate it to a very high degree, and I relatively posteriorly rotate the innominate, what happens if I have a huge lordotic curve? Watch this. So posteriorly rotated innominate, but I have a huge increase in lordosis. Ooh. That leads to what looks like an anteriorly tilted pelvis. How would you know that, though? The relative motion is a posterior rotation, but because the lumbar spine compensated in such a manner that it had such an increase in the lordosis, the pelvis looks tilted anteriorly, even though the mechanics are different. Hence, we can't trust our eyes. What we have to trust in this case is our testing, because we don't know what the relative motion is going to make the visual appearance look like. Or for that matter, so we can't trust visual appearance because I could have a case such as that. I'll give you guys another example. This one's probably a little bit more easy to see. So if I have someone who has a wide infrasternal angle, the bucket handle action is increased. Due to respiratory mechanics, we should also think that the pump handle action ought to increase. Same thing with posterior thorax expansion. So if I have increased pump handle, watch this. It looks like my thoracic spine is pretty flat and extended, right? Watch me do this. How about now? Well, respiratory-wise, I have a relative up pump handle in both of those cases. But due to my ability to compensate from a movement standpoint, I can have the appearance of either a up pump handle or down pump handle. In either case, can we trust the visual appearance? No. What we have to trust is testing. What we have to trust is our proxy measures for respiration to demonstrate what we think is going on at these relative girdles at the axial skeleton with the human. So, guys, what I want you to consider with this is that, yes, the mechanics say one thing, but we also have to realize that all of these bones are moving relative to one another. And if one moves more than another bone, that's going to mess up any visual inspection that we have, or any visual or success that we have trying to make a visual diagnosis. I'm starting to learn more and more and shift my thought process a little bit, especially after having many talks with Bill. We can't trust default posturing or a postural evaluation, at least just visually, because there's so many different compensatory strategies that us as humans can use that you just cannot make a good decision off of that. It's frustrating because sometimes you will see someone and expect one thing, and you go and lie them on the table and test them and get something completely different. I've had that many times. There's a guy who I remember had a really bad valgus collapse on his knee, and then he was externally rotated at the tibia, had medial knee pain. With this type of visual presentation, typically what I see is someone who has a lot of IR, limitations in ER, and because he's got the ER limitation, he had to externally rotate the tibia to compensate and make up for that movement. Guess what? He was limited in both directions. Can't trust what you would expect visually. You have to use the variability testing that I talked about in the previous question to really get an answer to this question. So, to summarize, nutation, posterior rotation of the pelvis, counter nutation, anterior rotation of the pelvis, those things go hand in hand. Curves increase or they decrease in relation to one another, and the extent to which these curves increase and decrease, and if we even go beyond that, to the extent that all the bones move in relation to one another, depends on relative motion and the extent that you compensate in the areas that you can compensate and move in the areas that you can or cannot move. Don't trust your eyes, trust your tests, and make your clinical decisions that way. And I think that's a good stopping point for tonight. I want to thank all you beautiful, sexy, outstanding people for attending tonight's movement debrief. I can't believe I've done 39 of these already. Next week, 40. Whew, crazy. I appreciate all you guys being here. Appreciate your support. And I'm sure you're probably wondering, Zach, you're so cool. Where can I learn more about you? I'm glad you asked. First off, go to zachcouples.com. Sign up for the newsletter. Here's what you're going to get. You're going to get almost 3 hours worth of talks. One about respiration, one about pain. You'll get almost 50 pages worth of notes. You want to know about those subjects? You better sign up for that newsletter. Not only that, but you're going to get a free acute to chronic workload calculator. So if you're doing some Tip Gabbett stuff and you want to measure acute chronic workload, I got an easy way to do it. Also, while you're there, you're going to get some weekend learning goodies every Friday that no one else will get until the end of the month. You'll be up on all the cool things that's going on the internet. Definitely sign up for the newsletter. Katie, appreciate you, homegirl. Once you've subscribed to the newsletter, then what you want to do is go to my online services page. I can do 3 things for you. I can probably do more than that, but I'll at least do 3 things for you. 1, movement consultations. If you're toy, and you're not moving as well as you'd like to, maybe you got some aches, pains, boo-boos, had them checked out, and you just want to see, hey, maybe if I, maximize my ability to move a little bit better, and I have some bald-headed joker take a look at me and see if he can help me with that, I might look better, feel better, move better, all these things. Well, in a movement consultation, I can do that for you. And if you are a trainer and you want to improve that in your peeps so they can reach their goals more better, we can work together with the people that you're working with and help maximize their movement repertoire. Hit me up for a movement consultation. Once you've done that, you definitely want to hit me up for mentoring. Maybe you want to do some of this variability stuff I'm talking about, but you just don't know how to implement it. You don't even know where to start. Maybe you work in a big group and you want to try to implement this stuff and you don't know how to do that and what's the most efficient way possible. Maybe you want a little bit of help organizing yourself in your day. Well, guess what? That's what the mentorship program is for. If you want to go ahead and sign up for that, we'll talk on whatever basis we need to talk on, help you reach your goals, get you to the level that you want to be at. We'll do it together. So thank you for the mentorship sessions. Next up, go to the bottom tab, online fitness training. Are you post-rehab? Do you want to lean out? Do you want to get big? Do you want to improve your athletic performance? I can train you. I've worked with some peeps, all shapes and sizes. I've worked with fat loss. I've worked with NBA players. I've worked with a lot of different people, gotten some good results. And I want to bring those results to you. Hit me up for online fitness training. Once you have looked at every single thing I've ever written on ZachCouples.com, you'll then want to sign up for the Zach Couples Show on iTunes. Because guess what, guys? I did 38 other debriefs. And maybe you don't want to look at me the whole time. You can just listen to them on iTunes. Go there, review my stuff, sign up for iTunes, and let me be in your car with you at all times. Once you've done that, then you probably want to hit me up on social media. First, go to Facebook, /ZCouples. Hit me up, sign up. I share stuff on there. I write things. You'll get access to a lot of stuff. You'll be able to communicate with me one-on-one. It'll be great. Hit me up on Facebook. Then you want to go to Twitter. My handle is @ZCouples. Hit me up there because I will tweet some things. Some clinical pearls that I have that maybe are too small for a blog post. Then, of course, we got to go to that Instagram, baby. You want quotes, you want pictures, you want videos of me doing stuff. Hit me up on Instagram. Zach, ZAC Couples, CUPPLES. I'll be on there. And last but not least, ladies and germs, go to YouTube, search Zach Couples, hit subscribe. You'll see all the exercises that I do with my movement consultation people. And I come up with new stuff. It seems like almost every week because I'm just, I'm experimenting, trying to find what's going to be best for my people. Hopefully those moves can help you. Otherwise, thank you guys so much for listening. I appreciate each and every one of you. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving, and I'll see you next time. Deuces. And we shall end.